Hello everyone, it is Professor G. I hope that everyone is doing well and is having a good semester so far. This week, I want to do something a little bit different. I actually want to switch things up. Typically, with these videos, what I do is I focus on whatever material we are reading through or watching that week. And so I kind of walk through my own ideas about whatever the story is or whatever we're talking about. So this week, what we're doing is we're moving into a slightly different genre. Some of us might be very familiar with it. Some of us might be a little bit familiar with it, and we might be somewhere in between. That is fine. What I want to do is I want to just talk about the history of children's literature as a genre. And then at the end, I'm going to hand it over to you through Canvas, through everything on there, so that we can engage in conversation about what this genre looks like now and how it changed over time. So what I'm going to do is something I almost never do, which use PowerPoint. I'm honestly not a huge fan of PowerPoint, but it is a really good tool for giving everyone a lot of information very, very quickly. The first thing I want to do as a way of introducing children's literature is I want to give everyone a question. And I actually want you watching the video right now to pause the video after the question and think about some answers, because they're going to help us as we move forward, not just with the lecture, but with everything on Canvas. So my question is this: when you think of children's literature, what stories come to mind? All right, so right now, on your computer, on your cell phone, on your tablet, press pause, think about some examples. Try to come up with at least one or two of them, and then hit play. So hopefully at this point, you actually did pause it and are going forward. Otherwise, you just saw me pause awkwardly for a couple seconds, which is fine. I'm an awkward person. It happens. So hopefully you have some ideas of examples of children's literature. So I want you to table them. I want you to kind of keep them in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to them. All right. So before talking about them, I want to talk about the history of children's literature, especially in the English language. So we might be surprised about how long it's actually been around. So one of the earliest examples of children's literature is printed in 1671, and it's called James Janeway's A Token for Children. This is probably the most depressing book you can find. It is literally a collection of death stories about children. These children range anywhere between 2 years and 9 years old, and the stories are all remarkably similar. A child is born, they live for a few years, they recognize that they have to know God, and then they die, right? And so the point is, in many ways, that these stories are very similar to each other. They're actually establishing a pattern. And James Janeway, and I don't think this is a shocker by any means, was a preacher, right? He had a very particular religious investment, spiritual investment, and that kind of works its way into his early example of children's literature. Now, I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that during this time, infant mortality rate is really, really high. Most children passed away before they turned the age of 4. All right, so this is a time period, and again, this is 1671, when medicine, as we understand it right now, didn't really exist. This is actually about 100 plus years before germ theory. So in 1671, they didn't know what a germ was. They actually didn't yet come to the conclusion that there are these tiny things that can get us sick and then kill us. So they didn't get that. So because of that, infant mortality rate and mortality rate in general, very, very high. And the basic argument of the book was this: it is never too young to think about religion. That we, and this is Janeway's idea, that even if a child is 1 year or 2 years old or 3 years old, it's still worth giving them a spiritual upbringing, because that's going to allow them to get into heaven, because, again, 1671, they can die at any time. And this book, A Token for Children, had a project in mind, and the project was this. It was to answer the questions, what is it like to be a child? It's kind of the first part of the project. And the second part of the project was, how can I write specifically for children? And I'll also say, just as a former background, that this book, when it's first printed in 1671, is a huge bestseller. And it's translated into different languages, and it makes Janeway, and there's an image of it on the screen now, it makes him instantly famous. Since 1671, a lot of things have changed. All right, so now if you pick up a children's story, they tend to be happier. They tend to be more uplifting. They also tend to have a moral at the center of them. Not always, but a lot of them have some sort of lesson that the child can use. And in fact, that becomes its own kind of difference, because right now, children's stories that are being printed and that are being popular, they often have lessons about how the child can function in society. So if you go into a bookstore now, or a library now, or anything like that, and you go to the children's literature section, you will see books, or will likely see books about saying please and thank you, about sharing, about being accepting of diversity, right? So these are stories that are about functioning in society in 2021 or whenever they're written. This was not Janeway's focus. He just didn't have it as a part of his idea of what children's literature should do. So it is something that's added a little bit later. Another thing that's added later is images. Now, if you look at children's stories, there are often images. So these are illustrations, pictures, and these are a way to draw in young readers. That as a technique really didn't exist for Janeway, at least not in the way that it does now. However, not everything has changed. I think that it is worth focusing on what has remained consistent from 1671. And one of those things is the project itself. In many ways, the question at the heart of children's literature is consistent, right? The question is, what do I need to do to write stories for children? And typically children's stories are written by adults trying to imagine what it might be like to be a child in 2021 or 2020 or 2022, trying to figure out how you can appeal to that author. So the project is very similar. And so in fact, with children's literature, we have a slightly different version of a question we've talked about, right? We've talked a lot about how stories are told, right? And that's something that we've come back to basically every week. Now, the question is just slightly different. So it's, how can I tell a story for children, right? Just has a very specific target audience. Now, I want to move forward from Janeway a little bit, and I want to talk about what is usually regarded as the golden age of children's literature. This is typically between 1865 and 1926. So, we started off this video by having everyone take 30 seconds to think about examples. Now, there is a pretty good chance that for a lot of us, the examples that popped into our minds are not new. Many of the examples of children's literature that are still kicking around and being adapted and moved around were written over 100 years ago, or around 100 years ago. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This is first printed in 1865. Pinocchio. All right, very popular. First printed in Italian, 1883. So it's been around for 130 years or so. Peter Pan was first created in 1904, so over 100 years old. Dr. Dolittle. They just did a version of this, a film version of this, a year or two ago. So continues to be imagined, to be adapted. It's been around for just over 100 years. Winnie the Pooh, first written in 1926. And a lot of the stories that we see in movies, in TV shows, in books, a lot of those stories have carried over from A.A. Milne's original one in 1926. Smack in the middle of this is one of the examples I'm going to give you in this course. And this is The Tale of Peter Rabbit. All right, so this was printed in 1902. So I think this is exceptionally important because the kinds of stories that people come back to again and again and again, have actually been around for a long time and continue to shape children's literature going forward. And there are a ton of other examples, and some of these we may have thought of. So anything by Dr. Seuss, right? So I have Green Eggs and Ham up there. You might have thought of One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. You might have thought of the Butter Wars. You might have thought of the Sneetches. You might have thought of Cat in the Hat. Whatever you remember, right? That's Dr. Seuss is one of these giants in children's literature. Charlotte's Web is a huge one too, still very influential. We might know, especially if we have kids now, the Elephant and Piggy series, right? It actually just ended. Harold and the Purple Crayon, a really interesting example of how to tell a story mostly through images and not through words. Goodnight Moon, all right, that's an example. Anything by Roald Dahl, all right, so he wrote Matilda, he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, he wrote James and the Giant Peach, right? So also a giant in children's literature were all these different books that we come back to. The Very Hungry Caterpillar. As I'm making this video right now, Eric Carle, who wrote that book, passed away less than 2 weeks ago. All right, so The Very Hungry Caterpillar continues to be this really influential example of children's literature. And this is one of my wife's favorites, so I put it on there. So Is Your Mama a Llama? So again, really about family. He really uses images to get across the story. So I want to take a step back now. Now that we have those examples, and you likely had your own example in your head, which maybe I mentioned, maybe I didn't, depending on what you chose. But I want to take a step back and I want to think about how children's writers, tell stories. All right, a big thing they do is, especially now, is use images. Images are great ways to draw in young readers. I think that a lot of us know that. They're also extremely complicated. They're really hard. And we've talked about them in images in various forms, especially with spoken word poetry, with Rupi Kaur's poetry, right? And a couple other examples. So images are really powerful and complicated ways for telling stories. All right. And images are also the closest we really have to universal storytelling devices. What I mean by that is that a child can pick up something like The Tale of Peter Rabbit or Dr. Seuss, anything like that. And they could get a lot just from looking at the image, right? They could actually go through and read The Cat in the Hat. Even if they don't know English, even if they can't read, they can get a pretty good idea of the narrative just through the images. So this is a way to appeal to to children who may not be reading yet, or maybe reading in a different language. All right. So another thing that children's stories tend to do now, and they didn't for Janeway, was use animals. All right. So, and they often talk with no explanation. This is very much the case in Disney movies. All right. There are so many examples of this. So the animals are a way of engaging children, getting them to read in certain ways. The other thing that children's literature does is it uses simple, easy to understand language. So we talked about with poetry, how part of the idea is to confuse us. So that if we read a line of poetry and we don't get it yet, if it confuses us, it actually means that the poem may be working, right? Because what it's trying to do is it's trying to get us to reread it and pay closer attention next time. Children's literature doesn't do that. It does the opposite. That the goal often of a children's story is to be easy to understand from the very beginning. So what I want to do now is I want to pop out of my little video just to kind of conclude things. So these are just some ideas about where children's literature comes from and where it's going. Now I'm going to hand it off to you, and we are going to be looking at Little Red Riding Hood, Charles Perrault's version, which is one of the earliest written versions, and we'll also be looking at The Tale of Peter Rabbit. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what everyone made of them as examples of children's literature, and then we will go from there.